I have been interested in the population problem for a while. I have written about it in the Newsweek, for example, mention it in a lot of places about exactly what the role of population is in climate change, because early on it was quite common to blame Mexico, India, and China, for example, as having such large populations that climate action was not going to matter much because of the population. But since then, we know that it's the per capita consumption that matters, and the historic accumulated CO2 belongs mostly to the rich countries. So even the couples that have very few kids in the rich countries are not really reducing their overall consumption. They are giving each kid more resources, and kids consume more. So per capita consumption is also a bit misleading, because when you average over a lot of people in China and India, the rich people are still living like the Western world. So we have to be careful anyway. But there is another point that is very important, and that is if you educate girls, the fertility rates drop. Educated girls have fewer kids. There are some numbers about how fertility rates drop. But this working paper essentially is going after something rather interesting. It says the fertility rates dropped in two phases. As early as the 1970s, the rich countries, the Western world, had a drop in fertility rates, and the developing world, like India and China, started to have dropping fertility rates only in the 1980s and 90s. And now it's quite well known that girls are not getting married, they're not interested in having children, and China has hit peak population and is trying to incentivize women to have children, but that's not how it works. You cannot pay a woman to have kids. And there are many details. So the argument in this paper essentially is that the fertility rates drop, especially below replacement rate of 2.1, when there is a economic change as opposed to economic growth. Economic growth has a certain rate of annual increase in, let's say, GDP, and that doesn't necessarily induce any changes in traditional cultural value systems and so on, especially in terms of the role of the women in, let's say, taking care of the children versus the man earning the living and so on. But when economic change happens, the female labor force participation can jump, and the traditional value system can get seriously affected, where women begin to expect men to spend more time helping with child uh, children childcare. Okay, let's say. So let's look at some numbers here to get a better sense. We'll read the abstract and make a few quick points. So as I said, this is a working paper. Maybe it's published by now, so you can go and look for it. Babies and the macroeconomy. Fertility levels have greatly decreased in virtually every nation in the world, but the timing of the decline has differed. Even among the developed countries in Europe and Asia and North America, total fertility rates of some nations dipped below the magic replacement figure of 2.1 as early as the 1970s. In Asia, it's the Japanese fertility rate, but in other nations, fertility rates remained substantially high until the 1990s but plummeted subsequently. This paper addresses why some countries in Europe and Asia with moderate fertility rates in 1980s have become the lowest low nations today. So the fertility rate has dipped to as low as 1.3, which is scary. Uh, we may end up with a very low population by 2100 if we continue this way, and that has its own consequences in terms of elderly care, etc. Also addressed in this paper is why the crossover point for two groups of nations was around the 1980s and 1990s. An important factor that distinguishes the two groups is their economic growth in the 1960s and 70s. Countries with the lowest low fertility rates today experienced rapid growth in GNP per capita after a long period of stagnation or decline after the war, where so they were catapulted into modernity, but the beliefs, values, and traditions of their citizens changed more slowly. Thus, swift economic changes may lead to both generational and gendered conflicts that result in a rapid decrease in the fertility rate. So, countries like India and China also have a stronger male dominated societies, maybe compared to the Western world. So, the response to climate change, sorry, not climate change, economic change would also be slightly different. Nonetheless, the basics are essentially the same that anti-immigrant sentiment and populist rhetorics have elevated and altered the importance of increasing the birth rate in several countries like North America, Europe, and parts of Asia. Japan doesn't allow immigrations at all. In consequence, policymakers have considered and adopted an array of measures to increase fertility, but as we know from many countries, China, of course, and all the Western countries, Greece, Spain, Portugal, France, Germany, etc., have not had any luck in boosting fertility rates. But the birth rate is also clearly determined by forces that are independent of the whims of governments, and that has been the case since the beginning of time. I'll add to an extensive literature on fertility by emphasizing forces that have affected the birth rate through the emergence of conflicts between generations and genders. Okay, so if women get educated and they join the workforce, and they refuse or are unwilling to continue with the traditional practices where elders males dominate typically, and even the mother-in-law, for example, may be expecting traditional behaviors from women. So that's the conflict between generations, and genders, of course, between men and women always comes up when women play less prominent role in doing household chores and child rearing and so on. So one began the period since the 1950s with high birth rates, but eventually has had very low birth rates by now. Other nations began the period with moderate birth rates and have remained at relatively moderate levels. What are the forces that have led to couples in some developed countries to have much lower fertility than in others, and why has fertility declined during particular periods? So the details are there. I'm not going to go into all of those, but several countries are looked at. So 12 in the first period and several in the second period. Of course, Denmark, France, Germany, Sweden, the UK, and the United States from the 1950s to the 70s. Japan is also there, but la la la. There are Greece, Italy, Japan, Korea, Portugal, and Spain. These nations also happen to be disproportionately Catholic or Orthodox, and two, Japan and Korea have non-Western belief systems with traditions that emphasize family ties and clan identity. Japan is quite notorious for being quite male dominated. The first group of nations reached a total fertility rate of around 2 by the 1970s and remained at approximately that figure until around 2010. The second group of nations had fertility rates that remained high through the 1970s but then plummeted in the 1980s and 90s, becoming what is termed lowest low, with total fertility rates below 1.3. So this author shows that rapidly and abruptly changing uh, fertility rates have something to do with economic growth and women getting greater freedoms, but uh, rapid economic change may lead to conflicts of various types when men are uh, more swayed by traditions that women require of men's time to raise a family and be members of a modern labor market may exceed the time their more tradition bound spouses or future spouses are willing to offer. So in the US now they have a term called trad wife, which is the traditional wife, and there is a debate about whether Taylor Swift will be a trad wife and so on and so forth. So women have a big role to play in this. Obviously, it shows up in educating girls as well, as I said. So driving channel for fertility rates dropping is not just the speed of economic growth. Rather, it's the transformation from a society that is less well connected, more tradition bound, relatively isolated and rural, and communal rather than individualistic into a nation that is generally the opposite, with more developed markets, thicker communication networks and denser settlements. It's the speed with which tradition-bound people are catapulted into modernity that gives generations little time to adapt and bring old ways into sudden conflict with the new. Okay, so this is termed generational conflict by the author, and of course, it becomes a gendered conflict when the husband's desire for more children exceeds that of the wives. And when they find a solution, it may be that you end up with obviously lower fertility rates in the sense the parents to the kids, the number of children drops significantly, maybe from four to five to just one or two. When the nations develop more continuously and across a longer time frame, less generational conflict arises and the fertility desires of men and women are more similar. Household and caring tasks are more evenly divided within the couples and fertility levels are in consequence higher because there is a compromise involved in bringing up family. The reduction or kids. The reduction in fertility in the first half of the century in the half of the century since the 1970s in most of the world, including the 12 nations just mentioned, has been astonishing. I hope to convince you that some part of the fertility decline in the past 50 years has had much to do with the macroeconomy in a long run sense. Thus, I will address how the macroeconomy has affected fertility, given that traditions and beliefs change more slowly than do economies, obviously. Let's just look at some figures. You got the idea of the paper essentially, so let's not spend too much time on the details. Total fertility rates in 8 nations from 1950 to 2018, and you can see there was some flat, some drop. The UK dropped quite significantly and then has been hanging around now, dropping well below 2. There are other countries, Denmark here, Germany, Italy, Spain, Sweden, UK, USA, and Japan from the Asian continent shows up here. Total fertility rates across 4 countries and the world for 1950 to 2022. Nigeria remains high, it's still going strong. Various socioeconomic factors. Mexico dropped and continues to drop, is below 2. And so, this is why arguments about population and climate change can be misleading. And here is China, which dropped precipitously, surprisingly, but in the 80s and 90s. And here is the world. India dropped more slowly than China did. And of course, China is not a democracy, so works differently. You know, they had a one-child policy, etc., which has been discussed much, but let's not go into that here. So if you look at the schematic relationship between fertility and women's labor force participation, you'll see fertility rates, total fertility rate, high at 4 to 7, moderate at 1.7 to 3, and low at less than 1.7. So if you look at female labor force participation rate, when the participation is low, the fertility rate is high. As uh, participation increases, the fertility rates drop to low. So moderate FLFP, which is female labor force participation rate, comes with low fertility and high division of labor at home. Men have to be involved in household chores and helping with the kids. But eventually, when the labor participation goes up, you recover and have a higher FLFP, but moderate fertility, low division of labor at home. So somehow women now become more willing to take up. So the division of labor is in fact lower than here, where the fertility rate is the lowest. So in other words, there are two factors. One, female labor force participation has an impact on fertility rate, but the division of labor at home seems to be a strong factor as well. So the socio-cultural aspect there is that what is expected of women and how women are able to deal with it while sharing household responsibilities. Total fertility rates of for 2 groups of nations, 1990 to 2022. Group 1, if you go back to again 1920, fertility rates dropped. There may be some conflation immigration here, but there may also be an immigration boom leading to high fertilities. But you can see all of them seem to jump here after the war, let's say, and then there is a drop in the 1970s, and then they have basically remained low, but UK dropped and France has dropped and so on. So not very easy, but still you can see the trends clearly that there is definitely some relation over time to macroeconomic uh, factors. Group 2 nations here you have Greece, Italy, Japan, Korea, Portugal, and Spain. All have dropped here. You can see they all cluster here from the 1990s at about 1.5 or less, which is really amazing. And South Korea has now become real showpiece for how low it can go. It's less than one. That's scary. So the government is obviously really worried. So is Japan. Remains well below 1.5 here. Okay, so this is the second cluster of countries which took a dip after the 1980s and 1990s. So they experienced the economic change, economic growth. They're related, but economic change is much more rapid, requiring uh, much shorter time for adjustments of traditional values, especially in terms of women's responsibility at home. And if it doesn't happen, then it shows up in fertility rates. So total fertility rates for selected group 1 and 2, group 1 and group 2 nations for 1970 to 2022. You can see now more dramatic drop in Korea, Spain, and then US and France, etc. Took a dip but have remained relatively steady, but Korea continues to drop, as we said before. Okay, there is a lot of discussion in the paper that you can go and look at. I'm just trying to say that the population problem is very complicated. We cannot say that higher population necessarily leads to higher climate change, consumption, emissions, etc. In fact, lower fertility rates come with higher uh, GDP per capita and higher consumption, and hence higher emissions as well. Log of gross domestic product per capita for two groups of nations for 1990. Log GDP per capita. So you can see that over the years, as GDP has uh, gone up, uh, yeah, GDPs have gone up over time for these countries in terms of per capita income, and Group Two nations had, so these started having an upswing in the post-war period, 50s and 60s, whereas these took longer, especially here Korea took much longer, only in the 1970s and 80s, although it started in the 60s, and similarly here. So you can see the stark difference in the where they start and where they go as well. So they are still lower, and they also started lower and grew later. That's the main point. Gender differences in unpaid household and care work and infertility as well. Time use and fertility among the 12 group 1 and group 2 nations. Total fertility rates here. I won't read all the details, but when you have female minus male daily hours of unpaid household labor, if female works harder and harder for unpaid household labor, then the fertility rates drop, which is what you already said, that the gender balance becomes an issue. Time use and fertility rates among 20 nations, again, total fertility rate, sorry, and female minus male daily hours of unpaid household labor, similar relation here, okay? The numbers are also the same in terms of number of hours, daily hours, okay? So what is the conclusion then? Decreased birth rates have been nearly ubiquitous around the world, but they aren't always due to changes in contraceptive practices or legal constraints, and they aren't always due to governmental policies that have tried to help working parents and or encourage women to have more children. I've emphasized instead that decreased birth rates can be due to macroeconomic changes, especially those that impact differences across generations, and thus that cause conflicts between the genders. Rapid economic change often challenges strongly held beliefs, and beliefs change more slowly than technology does and Economies do. Traditional people are often catapulted into modernity with little time for beliefs, traditions, or social mores to adjust. Thus, swift economic change may lead to generational and gendered conflicts and rapid reductions in birth rate. The model predicts they have built a model fitting to the data and looks at female and male time spent, equality, inequality, etc., in a very simple way. The model predicts that in periods of rapid and sudden economic and social change, men will want more children than women will want. The differences will be muted when the economies change. Economic changes are slower and lessen, but women will still want fewer children than will men. How can that change? The reason for the difference embedded in the simple model is that women spend more time with their children, often by sacrificing their career or by having lower incomes and thus becoming economically vulnerable. They have a different way of making choices when it comes to careers. They can sacrifice for the family, whereas men have no desire to do that. If they are, see, women are divorced or separated, they and their children may suffer. They know this in advance, and in consequence, will resist having more children. So they're protecting against, hedging their bets against eventualities such as divorce. But if fathers and husbands can credibly commit to providing the time and the resources, the differences in fertility desires between the genders would disappear. In terms of the simple model, this means that alpha M equals alpha F, female, male, let's say labor force participation and general equality. Commitment would guarantee cooperation, but commitment is difficult to ensure. You cannot legislate it. One method of commitment is to live in a country or state in which social opprobrium dictates that men provide the finance, time, and mental resources to the family. Perhaps that's part of the reason why most Nordic countries have managed to have reasonably high fertility as well as high female employment. But those are small homogeneous countries, which and their lessons may not necessarily apply in more diverse developing economies. Social insurance is not just that provided, just not that provided by the government. It's also the social capital of the society. So you have you have kids because that's some kind of an insurance for old age. That doesn't work anymore anyway, right? Kids are living somewhere, parents are living in a retirement home or on their own. But commitment does not eliminate the negative effects of income on fertility. I noted previously that a positive income gradient by country has emerged, but there are few examples of positive relationship between household income and fertility within countries. So if income goes up, fertility rates go down. So it seems to be a universal relation. One can still have a negative relationship, but uh, increase fertility across all income groups. Perhaps that's what happened in the US during the baby boom, but immigration may have played a big role as well. Anyway, coming to the end, the US baby boom is one of the few examples of a country with a total fertility rate less than 2 that greatly increased. The baby boom was partly accomplished by glorifying marriage, motherhood, the good wife, and the home, and then there was a spike in divorces in the 1970s, which is apparently related to this, but that's a different topic. Can a turnaround today be accomplished by glorifying parenthood, especially fatherhood, and changing workplace rules so fathers are not penalized for taking time off and requesting flexible work arrangements? One thing is clear, unless the negative relationship between income and fertility is reversed, the birth rate will probably not increase anytime soon. So you cannot just incentivize women to go have kids. Okay, so it's a nice story. It's in the climate and health section because this does relate to women's health, children's health, overall health, and overall